The sun was setting over Deadwood Creek when Sarah McKenna pushed through the swinging doors of Murphy's saloon. The wooden doors made a loud creak as they swung back and forth behind her. Every head in the place turned to look at her. Some men smiled. Others looked worried. Everyone knew who she was. Sarah walked slowly across the dirty wooden floor. Her boots made soft sounds with each step. She wore dark pants, a white shirt, and a black vest. Around her waist was a gun belt made of brown leather. The gun in the holster looked well used but clean. Her long brown hair was tied back with a simple ribbon. The bartender, an old man named Murphy, nodded at her. "Evening, Sarah," he said in a friendly voice. "The usual?" "Yes, please," Sarah said. She put one boot up on the brass rail at the bottom of the bar. Murphy poured her a glass of whiskey. She picked it up and turned around to face the room. There were about 20 men in the saloon. Some sat at tables playing cards. Others stood at the bar drinking. A few women in colorful dresses moved between the tables, serving drinks and talking to customers. Everyone seemed to be having a good time, but Sarah could feel the tension in the air. In the past month, 5 different men had challenged Sarah to gunfights. All 5 had lost. Word was spreading fast about the woman who could outdraw any man in 3 territories. Some men came to town just to see if the stories were true. Others came hoping to be the first man to beat her. Sarah took a sip of her whiskey and looked around the room. She recognized most of the faces. There was Tom Bradley, who owned the general store. He had challenged her 2 weeks ago and lost badly. His hand was still bandaged from where he had cut it falling down after she shot, the gun out of his grip. At a corner table sat 3 ranch hands from the Circle K ranch. They were playing poker and trying not to look at her. One of them, a young man named Billy, had been talking all week about how he was going to be the one to finally beat Sarah McKenna. But now that she was here, he seemed less sure of himself. Near the back of the room, an older man with gray hair sat alone. This was Judge Harrison, who had been in Deadwood Creek for over 20 years. He had seen many gunfighters come and go. He always told people that Sarah was different from the others. She was not cruel or mean. She did not look for fights. But when someone challenged her, she never backed down. Sarah finished her whiskey and set the glass down on the bar. She was about to order another when the saloon doors opened again. This time they opened very slowly and quietly. A man stepped inside. He was not very tall, but he looked strong. He wore old leather chaps over his pants. His shirt was faded, blue, and his vest was brown with wear marks on it. On his head was a black hat with a wide brim. The hat was pulled down low over his eyes, making it hard to see his face. The man's boots were old, but well cared for. Around his waist was a gun belt that looked like it had seen many years of use. The leather was dark and smooth from handling. The gun in his holster was different from most guns Sarah had seen. It looked older but very well maintained. As soon as the stranger entered, the saloon became quiet. The card players stopped their game, the women stopped serving drinks. Even the piano player in the corner stopped playing. Everyone stared at the new arrival. The man walked slowly to the bar. He did not look left or right. He did not seem to notice that everyone was watching him. His movements were smooth and careful, like a cat walking through tall grass. "Whiskey," he said to Murphy. His voice was quiet but clear. Murphy quickly poured a drink and slid it across the bar. The man picked up the glass but did not drink right away. Instead, he turned slightly and looked around the room. Sarah studied him carefully. There was something different about this man. He was not like the others who had come to challenge her. Those men had been loud and boastful. They had made sure everyone knew why they were there. This man seemed to want no attention at all, but Sarah could tell he was dangerous. The way he stood, the way he moved, the way his hand rested near his gun, everything about him said he was a man who had been in many fights and had won them. Several minutes passed in silence. The man sipped his whiskey slowly. Sarah watched him in the mirror behind the bar. Finally, she decided to speak. "You are new in town," she said. It was not a question. The man turned his head slightly toward her. She could see part of his face now. He had dark eyes and a mustache. There were lines around his eyes that came from years of looking into the sun. A small scar ran along his left cheek. "Just passing through," he said quietly. Sarah smiled. "Most men who come through Deadwood Creek these days have heard about me. They come looking for a fight." The man took another sip of his whiskey. "I do not look for fights," he said. "That is good," Sarah said. She turned to face him directly. "Because I have not lost one yet." Some of the men in the saloon began to whisper to each other. This was the moment they had been waiting for. They expected the stranger to challenge Sarah McKenna. They expected him to boast about how fast he was with a gun. They expected him to make threats or demands. Instead, the man simply adjusted his hat. He pushed it down a little lower over his eyes. Then he finished his whiskey in one long drink. "Another," he said to Murphy. Sarah felt confused. This was not how these meetings usually went. Men who came to challenge her made it known right away. They wanted everyone to see them as brave. They wanted to make a name for themselves by beating the famous Sarah McKenna. This man seemed to care nothing about her reputation. He acted like she was just another person in the saloon. "You know who I am," Sarah said. Again, it was not a question. "I know," the man said. Murphy poured him another whiskey. "And you are not interested in testing yourself against me?" The man turned to look at her directly for the first time. His dark eyes met hers. Sarah felt a strange feeling in her stomach. There was something in those eyes that she had never seen before. Not fear, not anger, not excitement. Something else entirely. "No man has beaten me yet," she said, her voice louder now so everyone in the saloon could hear. The stranger looked at her for a long moment. Then very slowly he reached up and adjusted his hat again. He pushed the brim down until his eyes were completely hidden in shadow. "That's so?" he said quietly. Then he turned back to his drink and said nothing more. The silence in the saloon stretched on. Sarah felt her face getting red. She was used to men either running away in fear or immediately challenging her to a fight. She did not know what to do with a man who simply did not care. Finally, the piano player began to play again. Slowly, the conversation started up. The card game resumed. But everyone kept glancing at Sarah and the mysterious stranger, waiting to see what would happen next. Sarah ordered another whiskey and tried to think. Who was this man? Where had he come from? And why was he the first person who did not seem impressed by her reputation? She looked at him in the mirror again. He stood perfectly still, drinking his whiskey slowly. There was something about him that made her feel uneasy. Not afraid exactly, but uncertain. For the first time in months, Sarah McKenna did not feel completely in control of a situation, and she was not sure if she liked that feeling or not. 3 days had passed since the quiet stranger arrived in Deadwood Creek. Sarah McKenna found herself thinking about him more than she wanted to admit. Every morning, she walked past Murphy's saloon hoping to see him. Every evening, she went inside for her usual drink looking for the man with the black hat, but he was never there at the same time she was. Sarah began asking questions around town. She started with Murphy, the bartender. "That stranger," she said, leaning against the bar. "What do you know about him?" Murphy wiped down a glass with a dirty towel. He was an old man who had seen many people come and go. "Not much," he said. "Pays for his drinks in silver coins, real silver, not the fake stuff some folks try to use. He is polite but does not talk much." "Does he say where he comes from?" Murphy shook his head. "Nope. But I can tell you one thing. That man has been in some serious trouble before. Look at his hands next time you see him." Sarah waited, but Murphy did not explain what he meant. She left the saloon feeling more curious than before. The next person she talked to was Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house where most visitors stayed. Mrs. Henderson was a thin woman with gray hair who knew everything that happened in town. "Oh, that man," Mrs. Henderson said when Sarah asked about him. "He stays in room number 7, pays for a week in advance, very quiet. I never hear a sound from his room." "What does he do all day?" Sarah asked. That is the strange thing, Mrs. Henderson said, lowering her voice. He leaves early every morning before sunrise. Sometimes I see him walking toward the edge of town. He carries a small bag with him. Then he comes back before dark, but he never looks tired like a man who has been working all day. Sarah thanked Mrs. Henderson and left, but the information only made her more curious. That afternoon, Sarah decided to visit Tom Bradley at the general store. Tom had challenged her to a gunfight 2 weeks earlier and lost badly. His right hand was still wrapped in white bandages. Tom, Sarah said as she entered the store, I want to ask you about someone. Tom looked nervous. He always got nervous when Sarah came around now. Who? He asked. The stranger with the black hat. Has he been in here? Tom nodded quickly. Yes, yesterday morning. He bought some supplies, coffee, beans, hard biscuits. The kind of food a man takes when he is traveling. Did he say anything? Not much, Tom said. But I noticed something. When he reached for his money, I saw his hands clearly. They have scars on them. Old scars like rope burns. And there were calluses from holding a gun for many years. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. What kind of scars? The kind you get from being tied up, Tom said quietly. My brother was a sheriff down in Texas. He told me about men who had been captured and tied up by outlaws. Their hands looked like that. This was new information. Sarah thanked Tom and left the store, her mind racing with questions. As she walked down the main street, she almost ran into Judge Harrison. The old judge was coming out of the telegraph office holding a piece of paper in his hand. Sarah, he said. Just the person I wanted to see. What is it, Judge? Judge Harrison looked around to make sure no one else was listening. Then he pulled Sarah into the shade between two buildings. I sent a telegram to an old friend of mine, he said quietly. He works for the law down in Kansas. I asked him about men who matched the description of our mysterious visitor. Sarah waited. Her heart was beating faster. My friend sent me back some interesting information, the judge continued. There was a man named Jake Sullivan who worked as a marshal in Dodge City about 3 years ago. The description matches our stranger perfectly. What happened to him? Sarah asked. Judge Harrison looked at the telegram again. According to my friend, Marshal Sullivan was one of the best lawmen in Kansas. Fast with a gun, smart and fair. But then something bad happened. What kind of something bad? A gang of outlaws came to Dodge City. They were looking for Sullivan because he had arrested their leader the year before. The gang took a family hostage, a man, his wife, and their 2 young children. They said they would kill the family unless Sullivan came to face them alone. Sarah felt cold despite the warm afternoon sun. What did he do? Sullivan went, Judge Harrison said. But it was a trap. The gang had more men than anyone knew about. There was a big gunfight. Sullivan killed 4 of the outlaws, but not before they murdered the family they were holding hostage. The family died? Judge Harrison nodded sadly. All of them. The husband, the wife, and both children. Sullivan blamed himself. He turned in his badge the next day and disappeared. No one has seen him since. Sarah stared at the judge. Are you sure this Jake Sullivan is our stranger? I cannot be completely sure, Judge Harrison said. But the description fits perfectly, and there is something else. My friend says Sullivan was known for wearing an old black hat with a wide brim. He never took it off, even indoors. Sarah thought about the man in Murphy's saloon. He had indeed kept his hat on the entire time. Judge, she said, if this man really is Jake Sullivan, and he was such a good marshal, why is he here? What does he want in Deadwood Creek? Judge Harrison folded up the telegram and put it in his pocket. That is a very good question, Sarah, and I think you should be careful until we know the answer. That evening, Sarah went to Murphy's saloon earlier than usual. She wanted to see if the stranger would be there. She wanted to look at his hands and see the scars Tom had mentioned. The saloon was not very busy yet. Only a few men sat at the bar, and 2 tables had card games going. Sarah ordered her whiskey and waited. About an hour later, the stranger walked in. Sarah watched him carefully as he moved to the bar. Just like before, he ordered whiskey and stood quietly. looking straight ahead. Sarah moved closer to him. "Good evening," she said. He turned his head slightly toward her. "Evening." "I never got your name the other night," Sarah said. The man was quiet for a long moment. "Jake," he said finally. Sarah felt her heart jump. "Jake what?" But Jake did not answer. He finished his drink and put the glass down on the bar. As he reached into his pocket to pay for the whiskey, Sarah saw his hands clearly for the first time. Murphy and Tom had been right. There were old scars across his knuckles and around his wrists. The kind of scars a man gets from being tied up with rough rope. "You used to be a lawman," Sarah said quietly. Jake stopped moving. His hand was still in his pocket, but he did not pull out any money. He turned to look at her directly. "What makes you say that?" he asked. His voice was still quiet, but there was something different in it now, something harder. "The way you stand, the way you watch everything, the way your hand stays near your gun without you thinking about it. I have seen lawmen before." Jake stared at her for several seconds. Then he pulled some coins from his pocket and placed them on the bar. "I was," he said. "Not anymore." "Why not?" Jake adjusted his hat lower over his eyes. "Because some things cannot be fixed once they are broken." He turned and walked toward the door, but before he reached it, he stopped and looked back at Sarah. "You should know," he said, "that being fast with a gun is not always enough. Sometimes the fastest gun loses because speed is not the only thing that matters." Then he pushed through the doors and was gone. Sarah stood at the bar staring after him. Murphy came over and picked up Jake's empty glass. "Strange fellow," Murphy said, "but I think he is running from something, or maybe running toward something. Either way, he is a dangerous man." Sarah nodded, but she did not say anything. She was thinking about what Jake had said about speed not being the only thing that mattered. For the first time since she had learned to shoot, Sarah McKenna wondered if there were things about gunfighting that she did not understand. And she wondered what Jake Sullivan was really doing in Deadwood Creek. The morning sun had barely risen when Sarah McKenna heard the sound of horses running hard toward town. She was drinking coffee on the porch of Murphy's saloon when she saw young Billy Henderson racing down the main street on his father's old, brown horse. Billy jumped down from the horse before it had completely stopped. His face was red and covered with sweat. His clothes were dirty and torn. "Help!" he shouted. "Somebody help us!" People began coming out of buildings to see what was wrong. Sarah set down her coffee cup and walked toward Billy. "What happened?" she asked. Billy was breathing so hard he could barely speak. "The Morrison gang," he gasped. "They hit the Davis ranch last night. They killed everybody. Mr. Davis, Mrs. Davis, and their little boy Tommy." Sarah felt her blood turn cold. The Davis family had been good people. They had a small ranch about 10 miles north of town. Mr. Davis had always been kind to everyone he met. His wife made the best apple pie in the territory. Tommy was only 8 years old. "Are you sure they are all dead?" Sarah asked. Billy nodded, tears running down his face. "I saw them myself. My pa sent me to check on them because they did not come to town yesterday like they always do. When I got there, I found them in their house. They had been shot." More people gathered around Billy. Judge Harrison came running from his office. Murphy came out of the saloon, wiping his hands on his apron. "Did you see the gang?" Judge Harrison asked. "No," Billy said. "But they left a message. It was pinned to the front door with a knife." Billy pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. His hands were shaking as he handed it to Judge Harrison. Judge Harrison read the message out loud. "This is what happens to people who do not pay what they owe. The Morrison gang takes what it wants. Anyone who tries to stop us will end up like the Davis family." Sarah had heard of the Morrison gang before. They were a group of outlaws who robbed banks and ranches across 3 territories. Their leader was a man called Black Pete Morrison. People said he was completely crazy and would kill anyone who got in his way. "How many men are in this gang?" Sarah asked Billy. "I do not know for sure," Billy said. "But I heard there might be 8 or 10 of them, maybe more." Judge Harrison looked worried. "This is bad news. If the Morrison gang is in our area, no one is safe." We should send for the army, Murphy said. The nearest army post is 5 days away, Judge Harrison replied. By the time soldiers get here, the gang could rob every ranch in the territory. Sarah looked around at the crowd of people. She saw fear in their faces. These were good people, storekeepers, ranchers, families with children. They were not fighters. If the Morrison gang decided to attack Deadwood Creek, most of these people would not be able to defend themselves. I will go after them, Sarah said. Everyone turned to stare at her. For a moment, no one spoke. Sarah, Judge Harrison said slowly, this is not like the gunfights you have had in town. These men are killers. They will not follow any rules. They will try to shoot you in the back if they get the chance. I know, Sarah said, but someone has to stop them. If we do nothing, they will keep killing innocent people. You cannot go alone, Murphy said. There are too many of them. Sarah knew Murphy was right, but she did not see any other choice. The men in Deadwood Creek were not experienced fighters. Most of them had never been in a real gunfight. I can handle myself, Sarah said. No, you cannot. Everyone turned to see who had spoken. Jake Sullivan was standing in the doorway of the general store. He had been listening to the conversation. Jake walked slowly toward the group. Black Pete Morrison is not some drunk cowboy looking to make a reputation, he said. He is a killer who has been robbing and murdering people for over 5 years. He has stayed alive because he is smart and because he does not fight fair. How do you know so much about him? Sarah asked. Jake stopped a few feet away from her. Because I have been tracking him for 6 months. This was a surprise to everyone, including Sarah. Tracking him? Why? Jake was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because he killed some people I cared about, and because it is time someone stopped him. Sarah stared at Jake. She realized that this was why he had come to Deadwood Creek. He was not just passing through. He was hunting Black Pete Morrison. If you have been tracking him for 6 months, she said, why have you not caught him yet? Because he always has too many men with him, Jake replied. I am good, but I am not good enough to take on 10 armed outlaws by myself. Judge Harrison stepped forward. Are you saying you want to work together? Jake looked at Sarah. I am saying that if she is determined to go after Morrison, she needs help. And I need someone I can trust to watch my back. Sarah felt insulted. I do not need anyone to watch my back. Yes, you do, Jake said calmly. Morrison's gang does not fight like the men you have faced in saloons. They use tricks. They hide behind rocks and shoot from cover. They take hostages. They will do anything to win. I can handle tricks, Sarah said. Jake shook his head. You think gunfighting is about who can draw fastest. But when you are fighting for your life against multiple enemies, speed is only part of what matters. You also need experience, patience, and the ability to think clearly when people are trying to kill you. Sarah felt her face getting hot. She did not like being told she was not ready for something. I have plenty of experience. You have experience winning fair fights against single opponents, Jake said. That is very different from what we will face with Morrison's gang. The two of them stared at each other. The crowd of townspeople watched nervously, not sure what was going to happen. Finally, Judge Harrison spoke up. Maybe you two should work together. Sarah, you are the best shot in the territory. Jake, you have experience dealing with outlaws like Morrison. Together, you might actually have a chance. Sarah did not want to admit that she needed help, but she also knew that Judge Harrison was right. And she could not forget what had happened to the Davis family. If Morrison's gang was not stopped, more innocent people would die. Fine, she said. But I make my own decisions. I do not take orders from anyone. Jake nodded. Fair enough. But you have to promise me that you will listen when I tell you something is dangerous. I am not trying to protect you because you are a woman. I am trying to keep both of us alive long enough to stop Morrison. Sarah thought about this. She did not like the idea of taking advice from anyone. But she could see that Jake was serious about catching the gang, and she had to admit that he seemed to know more about outlaws than she did. All right, she said. We work together, but only until Morrison is caught. Jake adjusted his hat. That is all I am asking for. Judge Harrison looked relieved. Good. Now, what do you need from the town? Supplies, Jake said. Food for several days, extra ammunition, and information about where Morrison might be hiding. I can help with that, Murphy said. I know every ranch and hideout within 50 miles of here. Billy Henderson raised his hand. I want to help too. No, Sarah and Jake said at the same time. You are too young, Sarah continued, and you do not have enough experience with guns. Billy looked disappointed, but he nodded. Then what can I do? Jake thought for a moment. You can ride to the other towns in the area and warn them about Morrison. Tell them to be extra careful and to send word to us if they see anything suspicious. I can do that, Billy said, looking happy to have an important job. The crowd began to break up as people went to help gather supplies. Sarah and Jake were left standing alone in the street. So, Sarah said, where do we start? Jake looked toward the north, in the direction of the Davis Ranch. We start by looking at what Morrison left behind. Sometimes outlaws make mistakes that can help us track them. Sarah nodded. How long do you think it will take to catch them? Jake was quiet for a moment. That depends on how smart Morrison is and how lucky we are. But I can tell you one thing. This is not going to be easy. Are you sure you want to do this? Sarah thought about Tommy Davis, the little boy who would never grow up because of Black Pete Morrison. She thought about all the other innocent people who might die if the gang was not stopped. I am sure, she said. Jake nodded slowly. Then, we better get started. Morrison has a full-day head start on us, and he knows this territory as well as we do. As they walked toward the general store to gather their supplies, Sarah realized that everything in her life was about to change. She had never worked with a partner before. She had never tracked dangerous outlaws across the wilderness. She had never faced the kind of men who would kill entire families without hesitation. But she was about to learn all of these things, whether she was ready or not. And she had a feeling that Jake Sullivan was going to teach her more about gunfighting than she had ever imagined possible. The sun was setting behind the red rocks of Canyon Mesa when Sarah and Jake made their camp for the night. They had been tracking the Morrison gang for 2 days, following hoof prints and broken branches through some of the roughest country in the territory. Sarah was tired and frustrated. The trail kept disappearing on hard rock, forcing them to search in wide circles until they picked it up again. Jake seemed to know what he was doing, but he moved much slower than Sarah wanted to go. We could have covered twice as much ground if we had not stopped to examine every bush and rock, Sarah said as she unsaddled her horse. Jake did not look up from where he was studying the ground near a small stream. Speed does not matter if you are going in the wrong direction, he said calmly. Sarah threw her saddle down harder than necessary. At this rate, Morrison will be in Mexico before we catch up to him. Morrison is not going to Mexico, Jake said. He pointed to some marks in the soft dirt by the water. See these tracks? They are heading east toward Apache territory. Morrison knows that most lawmen will not follow him there. Sarah walked over to look at the tracks. She could see the hoof prints Jake was pointing to, but they all looked the same to her. How do you know those tracks belong to Morrison's gang and not some other riders? Jake knelt down and pointed to one of the clearer prints. See this mark here? It is from a horseshoe that has a chip in it. I have been following that same mark for 6 months. And see how deep this print is? That horse is carrying a heavy rider, probably a man with a lot of gear. Sarah studied the track more carefully. Now that Jake had pointed it out, she could see the small chip he was talking about. You have been following one horseshoe mark for 6 months? Among other things, Jake said. You learn to notice small details when you are tracking dangerous men. A broken branch, a cigarette stub, the way someone builds a fire. They all tell a story. Jake stood up and looked around their campsite. We need to be extra careful tonight. We are getting close to Apache territory, and there have been reports of war parties in this area. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Everyone in the territory had heard stories about Apache warriors They were said to be fierce fighters who could move through the desert like ghosts. "Have you dealt with Apaches before?" Sarah asked. Jake nodded as he began gathering wood for a fire. "A few times. Most of them just want to be left alone. But some of the younger warriors like to test themselves against white men. The best thing to do is avoid them if possible." Sarah helped Jake build a small fire in a ring of stones. As the flames grew brighter, the desert around them seemed to get darker and more mysterious. "Jake," Sarah said, as they ate a dinner of beans and hardtack biscuits, can I ask you something?" "Sure. Why did you really quit being a marshal? I heard about what happened in Dodge City, but there must be more to it than that." Jake stopped chewing and stared into the fire. For a long time, he did not say anything. Sarah began to think he was not going to answer. Finally, he spoke. "The family that died in Dodge City was named Peterson. John Peterson, his wife Mary, and their 2 children. A boy named David, and a girl named Susan. David was 10 years old. Susan was 7. Sarah waited quietly. She could see that this was difficult for Jake to talk about. "John Peterson was a shopkeeper," Jake continued. "He had never hurt anyone in his life. The only reason Morrison's gang took his family hostage was to get to me. They wanted revenge because I had arrested their leader the year before." Jake picked up a stick and poked at the fire. Sparks flew up into the dark sky. "I thought I was smart enough to save them," he said. "I had a plan. I was going to sneak up on the gang and take them by surprise, but Morrison was smarter than I was. He had men waiting for me that I did not know about." Sarah could hear the pain in Jake's voice. "What happened?" "There was a big gunfight. I killed 4 of the gang members, but not before they murdered the Peterson family. All of them. Even the children." Jake's voice was very quiet now. "I was supposed to protect innocent people. That was my job. And I failed." Sarah did not know what to say. She had never lost anyone close to her in a gunfight. She had never failed to protect someone who was depending on her. "It was not your fault," she said finally. "You did your best." Jake shook his head. "My best was not good enough. That is why I turned in my badge. I realized that sometimes the law is not enough to stop evil men. Sometimes you have to hunt them down like the animals they are." Sarah stared at Jake across the fire. She was beginning to understand why he had seemed so different from other men she had met. He carried a heavy burden of guilt and responsibility. "Is that what you have been doing for the past 3 years?" she asked. "Hunting down outlaws?" "Not all outlaws," Jake said. "Just the ones who hurt innocent people for no reason. Men like Black Pete Morrison." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of night animals. Sarah found herself thinking about her own reasons for becoming good with a gun. "Jake," she said, "I want to tell you something too." Jake looked at her with interest. "When I was 15 years old, a gang of cattle rustlers attacked our ranch. My father was away in town buying supplies. It was just me, my mother, and my younger brother Charlie at home." Sarah paused, remembering that terrible day. "The rustlers wanted our cattle, but they also wanted to hurt us because my father had testified against one of their friends in court. My mother tried to protect us, but there were too many of them." Jake leaned forward, listening carefully. "They killed my mother right in front of me," Sarah continued, her voice steady, but full of old pain. "Then they were going to kill Charlie. And me too. But I had learned to shoot when I was younger, and my father's gun was hanging on the wall." Sarah looked into the fire, seeing the past instead of the flames. "I shot 3 of them before the others ran away. Charlie and I survived, but our mother was gone." "I am sorry," Jake said quietly. Sarah nodded. "After that, I swore I would never let anyone hurt innocent people if I could stop it. That is why I became so good with a gun. That is why I never backed down from a fight." Jake was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So we are both trying to make up for people we could not save." "I suppose we are," Sarah said. They continued talking, as the fire burned lower. Sarah found herself telling Jake things she had never told anyone else. He was a good listener, and he did not judge her for the choices she had made. As the night grew later, Jake stood up and checked their horses. "We should take turns keeping watch," he said. "I will take the first shift, you get some sleep." Sarah spread her blanket on the ground near the dying fire. "Jake?" "Yes?" "Thank you for telling me about the Peterson family. I know it was not easy." Jake adjusted his hat and picked up his rifle. "Thank you for telling me about your family, too. It helps to know I am not the only one carrying old pain." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to sleep. But her mind was full of thoughts about Jake and the things he had told her. She was beginning to realize that he was not just a skilled gunfighter. He was a man who had been deeply hurt by his failure to save innocent people. Around midnight, Sarah woke up to the sound of a rattlesnake somewhere nearby. She sat up quickly, her hand moving toward her gun. Jake was standing a few feet away, perfectly still. He held up one hand to tell her not to move. Very slowly, he pointed to a spot near Sarah's feet. In the dim light from the dying fire, Sarah could see the thick body of a large rattlesnake, coiled just inches from where she had been sleeping. The snake's head was raised and its tongue flicked in and out as it tasted the air. Sarah's heart was pounding, but she forced herself to remain perfectly still. One wrong move and the snake would strike. Jake moved very slowly, drawing his gun, without making any sudden movements. The snake turned its head toward him, sensing the motion. In one quick, smooth movement, Jake fired. The bullet hit the snake just behind the head, killing it instantly. Sarah let out a long breath. "Thank you," she said. "That was too close." Jake holstered his gun and used a stick to move the dead snake away from their camp. Rattlers like to find warm places to sleep at night. You were unlucky that one chose a spot near your blanket. Sarah stood up and brushed off her clothes. "I owe you one." Jake smiled slightly. "We are partners now. Partners look out for each other." For the rest of the night, they shared the watch duty. Sarah found herself feeling grateful that Jake was with her. She had always prided herself on being independent, but she was beginning to see that having a reliable partner might not be such a bad thing. When the sun rose the next morning, they broke camp quickly and continued following the trail. But something had changed between them during the night. The distrust and competition Sarah had felt before was gone. In its place was the beginning of real partnership. As they rode deeper into Apache territory, Sarah realized that Jake had already saved her life once, and she had a feeling that before this chase was over, she might need to save his life too. That was what partners did for each other, and despite her fierce independence, Sarah was discovering that she liked having someone she could count on. The first light of dawn was just starting to show over the eastern mountains when Jake shook Sarah awake. She sat up quickly, her hand automatically reaching for her gun. "What is it?" she whispered. Jake put a finger to his lips and pointed toward a ridge about half a mile away. Sarah squinted through the gray morning light and saw smoke rising from behind the rocks. "Campfire," Jake whispered. "And I counted at least 8 horses when I was watching from that hill over there." Sarah felt her heart start beating faster. After 3 days of tracking, they had finally found Morrison's gang. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. Jake was already rolling up his blanket. "We get closer and see what we are dealing with. But we have to be very careful. If they spot us before we are ready, we will be in serious trouble." They packed their gear as quietly as possible and led their horses away from their campsite. Jake seemed to know exactly where he was going. He led Sarah through a maze of rocks and desert brush, always staying out of sight of the ridge where the gang was camped. After about 20 minutes of careful movement, Jake stopped behind a large boulder. "This is as close as we can get without being seen," he said. "I am going to climb up and get a better look. You stay here with the horses." Sarah did not like being told to stay behind, but she knew Jake was right. Someone needed to watch their horses, and Jake had more experience with this kind of scouting. Jake disappeared among the rocks above her. Sarah waited, listening for any sounds that might mean trouble. The desert was quiet except for the distant call of a hawk and the soft sound of wind moving through the brush. After what seemed like a very long time, Jake climbed back down to where Sarah was waiting. "It is definitely Morrison's gang," he said. "I saw 9 men and Morrison himself. They have made camp in a natural bowl between the rocks. There is only one good way in or out. That sounds like it could work in our favor, Sarah said. If we can block their escape route, we can trap them. Jake shook his head. That is exactly what they want us to think. Morrison is too smart to camp somewhere unless he has a secret way out. I am sure there is another path we cannot see from here. Sarah felt frustrated. So what do? We cannot just sit here and watch them. We wait, Jake said. Sooner or later, they will have to move. When they do, we follow them until we find a better place to make our move. Sarah did not like waiting, but she could see that Jake was right. Attacking 10 armed men in a place of their choosing would be suicide. They settled down to watch and wait. Jake used a small telescope to keep an eye on the gang's camp while Sarah tended to their horses and checked their weapons. Around midday, Jake suddenly grabbed Sarah's arm. They are moving, he said urgently, and they are coming this way. Sarah looked toward the ridge and saw men on horseback emerging from behind the rocks. They were riding in a line with one man in front who had to be Black Pete Morrison himself. We need to get out of here, Jake said. If they see us, we will lose any advantage we might have had. But as they started to move their horses, Sarah heard the sound of boots on rock behind them. She spun around to see 2 men with guns pointed at them. They had come from a direction that neither Sarah nor Jake had been watching. Well, said one of the men with a nasty grin. Look what we found, Charlie, a couple of spies watching our camp. The second man, who had a scar across his nose, spit tobacco juice onto the ground. Boss is going to be real interested in meeting these two. Jake and Sarah were trapped. The 2 gang members were too far away to reach with their hands, but close enough that they could not miss with their guns. Drop your weapons, the first man ordered. Nice and slow. Sarah looked at Jake. She could see him thinking, looking for some way out of this situation, but she also saw him slowly reach for his gun belt. I said drop them, the scarred man shouted, raising his rifle. That was when everything happened at once. Jake dove to his left, drawing his gun as he moved. Sarah threw herself behind a large rock and pulled her own weapon. The 2 gang members started shooting. Bullets crashed into the rocks around them, sending chips of stone flying through the air. Sarah could hear Jake returning fire from somewhere, to her left, but she could not see him through the gun smoke and dust. One of the gang members ran toward Sarah's position, firing as he came. Sarah waited until he was close, then stepped out from behind her rock. Her first shot hit him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Her second shot finished him. She turned to help Jake and saw him standing over the body of the second gang member. His gun was still smoking. Are you hurt? Jake called out. No, Sarah replied. You? Jake shook his head, but Sarah could see blood on his left arm where a bullet had grazed him. We have to get out of here, Jake said urgently. The rest of the gang will have heard those shots. They will be here in minutes. They quickly gathered their horses and rode away from the area as fast as they could. Behind them, Sarah could hear the sound of many horses approaching the place where they had been hiding. They rode hard for over an hour before Jake finally called for a stop in a narrow canyon that offered good cover. Let me look at your arm, Sarah said. Jake rolled up his sleeve to show a shallow cut where the bullet had scraped along his skin. It is not serious, he said, but it was close. Sarah used water from her canteen to clean the wound and tore a strip from her shirt to bandage. You saved my life back there, she said as she worked. If you had not moved when you did, we both would be dead now. Jake winced as she tightened the bandage. You did pretty well yourself. That was good shooting under pressure. Sarah felt a glow of pride at the compliment, but she also realized something important. Jake, I have never been in a real gunfight before today. I mean, all my fights in town were face-to-face with rules. This was completely different. Jake nodded. Most people do not understand that. When you are fighting for your life, there are no rules. The only thing that matters is staying alive and stopping the other person from killing you. Sarah thought about how different the fight had been from her encounters in Murphy's saloon. The gang members had tried to shoot them from ambush. There had been no formal challenge, no countdown, no fair chance for everyone involved. How did you know to move when you did? She asked. Experience, Jake said. I could tell by the way that man was holding his rifle that he was about to shoot. In situations like that, the person who moves first usually wins. Sarah realized that Jake had just taught her something very important about real gunfighting. Speed with a gun was important, but so was knowing when to use it. "There is something else," Jake said. "Did you notice how those two men got behind us without us seeing them?" Sarah had been thinking about the same thing. They must have known we were there all along. Jake nodded grimly. "Morrison set a trap for us. He probably sent those men around behind us while the rest of the gang made noise breaking camp. We were so busy watching the obvious threat that we missed the real danger." Sarah felt foolish. "So Morrison knows we are following him." "He has probably known since yesterday," Jake said. "Maybe longer. Black Pete Morrison is not still alive because he is lucky. He is alive because he is smart." They sat in silence for a few minutes, both thinking about what had happened. Sarah was beginning to understand that hunting Morrison's gang was going to be much more difficult than she had imagined. "What do we do now?" she asked. Jake stood up and checked his gun to make sure it was loaded. "Now we stop trying to track them and start thinking like them. Morrison knows this territory well. He will go somewhere that gives him an advantage. Probably a place where he can see anyone coming from miles away. Do you know any places like that?" Jake nodded. "There is an old mining camp about 20 miles north of here. It sits on top of a mesa with only one way up or down. If Morrison is planning to make a stand, that is where he will go." Sarah felt a chill of fear mixed with excitement. "And if he goes there?" Jake looked at her seriously. "Then we will have to find a way to get up that mesa and face 10 armed killers in a place where they have every advantage." Sarah thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "Well, at least we know where we are going." Jake almost smiled at that. "Sarah, I have to ask you something. After what happened back there, are you sure you want to continue with this? No one would blame you if you decided to go back to town." Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking about the gunfight they had just survived. It had been terrifying and confusing and completely different from anything she had experienced before, but she also thought about the Davis family, lying dead in their house because Black Pete Morrison had decided to kill them. She thought about all the other innocent people who would die if Morrison was not stopped. "I'm not going back," she said firmly. "Morrison needs to be stopped, and we are the only ones who can do it." Jake nodded approvingly. "Then we better get moving. We have a long ride ahead of us and Morrison has a head start." As they mounted their horses and rode out of the canyon, Sarah realized that she had changed during the morning's events. She was no longer the confident young woman who had never lost a gunfight in Murphy's saloon. She was someone who had faced real danger and survived. And she was starting to understand that Jake Sullivan was teaching her things about courage and gunfighting that she could never have learned on her own. The old mining camp sat on top of Devil's Mesa like a crown of broken teeth against the evening sky. Sarah and Jake had been watching it from a hidden position in the rocks below for over an hour. Through Jake's telescope, they could see movement among the abandoned buildings. "How many men did you count?" Sarah asked quietly. Jake lowered the telescope and rubbed his eyes. "At least 8, maybe 9, and they have posted guards at the only path up the mesa. Morrison is definitely up there." Sarah studied the steep walls of the mesa. They rose straight up for over 200 feet with loose rock and dangerous drops on all sides. The narrow path that zigzagged up the face of the cliff was the only way to reach the top. "It looks impossible," Sarah said. "How are we supposed to get up there without being seen?" Jake was quiet for a long time, thinking. Finally, he said, "We are not, at least not both of us." Sarah turned to stare at him. "What do you mean?" Jake pointed to the mesa. "Morrison chose this place because he knows anyone trying to reach him will have to come up that path in the open. His men can shoot down at us from cover while we have nowhere to hide. So what are you suggesting?" Jake took a deep breath. "I think Morrison wants me to come up that path. He has been planning this ever since he found out I was tracking him. This whole thing is a trap designed to get me into a position where he can kill me." Sarah felt a cold fear in her stomach. "Jake, you cannot be serious about walking into an obvious trap." "It might be the only way to end this," Jake said. Morrison has been running from me for 6 months. He is tired of being hunted. He wants to finish this once and for all. Sarah grabbed Jake's arm. That is suicide. You said yourself there are at least 8 men up there. Even you cannot outdraw 8 gunmen at the same time. Jake nodded. You are right, but what if it was not just me? What if we could find a way for you to get behind them while they are focused on me? Sarah stared at Jake. Are you suggesting that you walk up that path as bait while I try to climb the mesa from another side? The backside of the mesa is not quite as steep, Jake said. With a rope, you might be able to climb it. If you could get to the top without being seen, you would be behind Morrison's men when I arrive. Sarah shook her head. Jake, that plan has too many things that could go wrong. What if I cannot make the climb? What if they see me? What if Morrison decides to just shoot you as soon as you start up the path? All of those things could happen, Jake admitted. But if we do nothing, Morrison will eventually come down from that mesa and continue killing innocent people. At some point, we have to take a risk. Sarah looked at the mesa again. In the growing darkness, it looked even more dangerous and impossible to climb. There has to be another way, she said. Jake was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Sarah, I need to tell you something. Yesterday, when we were in the canyon, I found this tied to a tree. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. Sarah took it and read the message written in rough handwriting. Jake Sullivan. I know you are following me. Come to Devil's Mesa alone tomorrow at sunset. Come up the path with your hands where I can see them. If you do not come, or if you bring help, I will start killing the people I am holding prisoner. Sarah felt her heart stop. Prisoners? What prisoners? Jake looked grim. I did not want to tell you before because I knew you would want to rush in without thinking. But Morrison has been taking hostages from the ranches he has robbed. I think he is holding them somewhere on the mesa. Sarah felt sick. How many people? Do not know for sure. But probably women and children from the families his gang has attacked. Sarah stared at the message again. The full horror of the situation was becoming clear to her. Morrison was not just a killer and a thief. He was holding innocent people prisoner, probably planning to use them as human shields. Jake, she said slowly, if Morrison has hostages, we cannot risk a big gunfight. Innocent people could be killed in the crossfire. Jake nodded. That is exactly what Morrison is counting on. He knows we will not do anything that might hurt the prisoners. That gives him all the advantages. Sarah felt trapped. Every option seemed to lead to disaster. If they attacked the mesa, the hostages might be killed. If they did nothing, the hostages would probably be killed anyway, along with more innocent people in the future. What if you go up the path like Morrison wants, but I follow you after dark? Sarah suggested. I could climb the mesa at night when it is harder for the guards to see me. Jake shook his head. Too dangerous. One loose rock, one wrong step, and you would fall to your death. Besides, Morrison will be expecting something like that. They sat in frustrated silence as the sun continued to set. Sarah had never felt so helpless. All her skill with a gun meant nothing in a situation like this. Jake, she said finally, what if we sent word to Morrison that we wanted to make a deal? Maybe we could trade ourselves for the hostages. Morrison does not make deals, Jake said. He only makes demands, and he would probably kill the hostages anyway just to hurt us before he killed us too. Sarah looked at Jake in the fading light. She could see the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He felt responsible for the Peterson family that had died in Dodge City. Now he was facing a similar situation with Morrison's hostages. There is something else, Jake said quietly. Morrison's message was addressed specifically to me. This is personal for him. He wants revenge for all the times I have interfered with his plans. What are you saying? Jake was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was very soft. I am saying that maybe the best thing I can do is give him what he wants. If I go up that path alone, maybe he will let the hostages go. Sarah felt anger flare up inside her. Jake Sullivan, if you think I am going to let you walk up there and get yourself killed, you are crazy. It might be the only way to save innocent lives. And it might be exactly what Morrison wants. To kill you and keep the hostages anyway. Sarah stood up and started pacing. There has to be another way, there has to be. As she paced, Sarah found herself thinking about everything Jake had taught her over the past few days. He had shown her that real gunfighting was not about speed, alone. It was about thinking, planning, and using every advantage you could find. Jake, she said suddenly, what if Morrison is lying about the hostages? Jake looked up at her with interest. What do you mean? Think about it. You said Morrison is smart. He knows you feel guilty about the Peterson family. What if he is using that guilt against you? What if he is making up the story about hostages to get you to walk into his trap? Jake considered this. It is possible. But if he really does have prisoners and we guess wrong, then innocent people die, Sarah finished. But Jake, innocent people are going to die anyway if we let Morrison escape again. They stared at each other in the growing darkness. Sarah could see that Jake was torn between his desire to save potential hostages and his knowledge that walking into Morrison's trap would probably accomplish nothing. There is only one way to find out if Morrison really has hostages, Sarah said. How? Sarah pointed to the mesa. We go up there and see for ourselves. Jake shook his head. Sarah, that is exactly what Morrison wants us to do. Maybe, Sarah said. But it is also the only way we can be sure. And if we are going to risk our lives anyway, we might as well do it on our own terms instead of his. Jake was quiet for a long time, thinking. Finally, he said, if we do this, it has to be done right. No rushing, no mistakes. We get one chance. And if we fail, a lot of people could die. Sarah felt her heart beating faster. What do you have in mind? Jake picked up his telescope and studied the mesa again. The guards Morrison has posted are watching the main path, but they are not watching each other very carefully. If we could take out the guards quietly, one at a time, we could reach the top without Morrison knowing we are coming. Sarah finished. Jake nodded slowly. It would be extremely dangerous. We would have to move at night in complete silence. One mistake would alert the whole gang. Sarah looked at the dark shape of the mesa looming above them. She had never attempted anything so dangerous in her life, but she also knew that innocent people were depending on them. When do we start? She asked. Jake checked his pocket watch. We wait until the moon sets. That will give us the darkest part of the night to work with. In the meantime, we rest and check our equipment, as they prepared for what might be their final battle. Sarah found herself thinking about her life in Deadwood Creek. Just a week ago, her biggest worry had been whether some cowboy would challenge her to a gunfight in Murphy's saloon. Now she was about to risk her life trying to save hostages and stop a gang of killers. Jake, she said as they settled down to wait for moonset, whatever happens up there, I want you to know that I am glad we are partners. Jake adjusted his hat and checked his gun for the 10th time. Sarah, if we do not make it through this, I want you to know that you are the bravest person I have ever met, and the best partner I could have asked for. They sat in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts as they prepared for the most dangerous night of their lives. The moon had set, leaving Devil's Mesa as a black shadow against the star-filled sky. Sarah and Jake moved like ghosts through the rocks at the base of the cliff, their boots making no sound on the sandy ground. Jake had blackened their faces, with mud and wrapped cloth around their gun barrels to prevent any shine that might give them away. They had studied the guard positions for hours through the telescope, memorizing every detail of the narrow path that led to the top. Remember, Jake whispered, as they reached the bottom of the cliff. We take out the guards one at a time, from bottom to top. No gunshots, no noise. If even one guard raises an alarm, Morrison will know we are coming. Sarah nodded, her heart pounding so hard she was sure Jake could hear it. She had never killed a man silently before. All her gunfights had been fast, loud affairs where speed and accuracy were all that mattered. The first guard was posted on a ledge about 50 feet up the path. Through the darkness, Sarah could see the red glow of his cigarette as he smoked, and watched the valley below. Jake pulled out a long knife with a leather-wrapped handle, Sarah did the same. Moving one careful step at a time, they began climbing the rocky path. It took them almost 20 minutes to reach the first guard's position. The man was sitting on a rock with his rifle across his knees, looking bored. He had no idea that death was creeping up behind him. Jake signaled for Sarah to wait while he moved behind the guard. In one smooth motion, Jake's hand covered the man's mouth while his knife found the guard's heart. The man struggled for just a moment, then went limp. Sarah felt sick watching it, but she knew they had no choice. These men had murdered entire families without mercy. They would kill her and Jake without hesitation if they had the chance. They dragged the guard's body off the path and continued climbing. The second guard was posted near a bend in the trail about halfway up the mesa. This man was more alert, constantly turning his head to look in different directions. This time Sarah took the lead. She crept up behind the guard while Jake created a small distraction by throwing a pebble to the man's left. When the guard turned to investigate the sound, Sarah struck. Her knife went between the man's ribs, piercing his heart instantly. He died without making a sound. 2 guards down. At least 6 more men to go, plus Morrison himself. The third guard was the most dangerous so far. He was positioned where he could see both up and down the path. There was no way to approach him from behind without being seen. Jake studied the situation for several minutes. Finally, he whispered to Sarah, "I am going to show myself and get his attention. When he moves toward me, you take him from the side." Sarah wanted to argue, but she could see there was no other way. Jake stepped out onto the path where the guard could see him. The guard raised his rifle, but before he could shout a warning, Sarah appeared beside him like a shadow. Her knife ended his life before he could make a sound. 3 down. They were now only about 30 feet from the top of the mesa. Sarah could hear voices coming from the old mining camp above them. The sound made her stomach tighten with fear and anticipation. The fourth guard was the hardest one yet. He was wide awake and suspicious, constantly scanning the darkness around him. Worse, he was positioned where the other gang members above could easily see him. Jake and Sarah spent almost an hour working their way into position. When they finally made their move, it had to be perfect. Sarah created the distraction this time, making a sound like a small animal in the rocks to the guard's right. When he turned to investigate, Jake appeared behind him. The guard died silently, but not before Jake had to struggle with him for several terrifying seconds. 4 guards eliminated. They were almost to the top. But as they prepared to climb the last section of path, Sarah heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a woman crying somewhere in the mining camp above them. Morrison really did have hostages. Jake heard it, too. His face went hard with anger and determination. They were no longer just hunting outlaws. They were racing to save innocent lives. The last section of the path brought them to the edge of the old mining camp. Through the darkness, Sarah could see the shapes of abandoned buildings and mining equipment. Somewhere among those buildings, Black Pete Morrison and his remaining men were waiting, and somewhere else, innocent people were being held prisoner. Jake signaled for Sarah to follow him as they left the path and entered the mining camp. They moved from shadow to shadow using the old buildings for cover. The first building they checked was empty except for mining equipment. The second contained sleeping rolls and supplies. This was where some of the gang had been sleeping. ND. The third building, they found them. 4 people were tied up in the corner of an old storage room. A woman in her 30s with a dirty, torn dress. 2 children, a boy and a girl who looked to be about 8 and 10 years old. And an elderly man with gray hair and frightened eyes. The woman looked up when Sarah and Jake entered. Her eyes went wide with hope and fear. Jake put a finger to his lips and moved quickly to cut their ropes. "Are there any other prisoners?" he whispered. The woman shook her head. "Just us," she whispered back. "They killed my husband and took us from our ranch 3 days ago." Sarah felt anger burning in her chest. Morrison's gang had destroyed another family, just like they had destroyed the Davis family and so many others. "Can you walk?" Jake asked. The woman. She nodded. The children clung to her, too frightened to speak. The old man rubbed his wrists where the ropes had cut into them. "We are going to get you out of here," Sarah whispered to them. "But you have to do exactly what we say." When we say it. Jake was looking out the window of the building. I count 5 men around a campfire in the main square, he said quietly. Morrison is one of them. There might be others we cannot see. Sarah joined him at the window. In the flickering light of the fire, she could see the men Jake was talking about. One of them was much larger than the others, with a black beard and cruel eyes. That had to be Black Pete Morrison. We need to get the prisoners to safety first, Jake said. Then we can deal with Morrison. But even as he said it, Sarah could see the problem. The prisoners would have to cross open ground to reach the path down the mesa. If any of Morrison's men saw them, there would be a gunfight with innocent people, caught in the middle. Jake, Sarah whispered, what if we split up? You take the prisoners down the path while I create a distraction to keep Morrison's attention. Jake shook his head immediately. Too dangerous. If Morrison's men surround you, you will not have a chance. And if we try to move the prisoners while Morrison is watching, they will not have a chance, Sarah replied. Someone has to draw the gang away from the path. They stared at each other in the darkness. Both knew that Sarah was right, but both also knew how dangerous her plan was. Before Jake could argue further, they heard footsteps outside the building. Someone was coming. Jake quickly motioned for the prisoners to hide behind some old mining equipment. He and Sarah pressed themselves against the wall on either side of the door. A man entered the building carrying a lantern. Sarah recognized him as one of Morrison's gang members, a thin man with a scar on his chin who had been sitting by the fire. The man looked around the room, holding his lantern high. When he saw that the corner where the prisoners had been tied was empty, his eyes went wide. Hey, he started to shout. Sarah and Jake moved at the same time. Jake's hand covered the man's mouth while Sarah knocked the lantern from his hand. The light went out, plunging the room into darkness. But they were too late. The man had already started to yell, and his voice echoed across the mining camp. The prisoners are gone, came Morrison's voice from outside. Find them, Sarah heard. The sound of running feet and men shouting to each other. Their plan had fallen apart. Now they would have to fight their way out with 4 innocent people depending on them for protection. Jake was already moving. Sarah, get the prisoners to the path. I will hold off Morrison's men. No, Sarah said firmly. We do this together, or not at all. Outside, they could hear Morrison organizing his men. Charlie, you and Red check the buildings on the left. Tom and Jake take the right side. I will watch the path so they cannot escape. Sarah realized that Morrison had made a mistake. By spreading his men out to search the buildings, he had made them easier to fight 1 or 2 at a time. Change of plan, she whispered to Jake. We take out his men while they are separated, then face Morrison together. Jake nodded grimly. It was risky, but it might be their only chance. Sarah turned to the woman prisoner. Take the children and hide behind those rocks near the path. Do not move until you hear us call your name. Do not move no matter what happens. The woman nodded and gathered the children to her. The old man followed them as they crept out of the building toward their hiding place. Now it was just Sarah and Jake against Black Pete Morrison and his remaining gang members. The final battle was about to begin. Sarah checked her guns one last time and looked at Jake. In the darkness, she could see the determination in his eyes. Ready? He whispered. Sarah nodded. Let us finish this. They stepped out of the building and into the night, moving toward the confrontation that would decide whether justice or evil would win the day. The gunfight that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. It was not the clean, fast duels of Murphy's saloon. It was desperate, chaotic, and deadly. Jake moved to the left while Sarah went right, using the old mining buildings for cover. The first of Morrison's men came around the corner of a storage shed, rifle raised. Sarah's gun spoke first, and the man fell without firing a shot. On the other side of the camp, she heard Jake's gun answer a shot from another gang member. Then silence. Jake. Morrison's voice echoed across the mining camp. I know you are out. There. Why do not you face me like a man instead of skulking around in the dark like a coward? Sarah moved carefully between 2 buildings, looking for her next target. She found him crouched behind a pile of old mining equipment, trying to get A clear shot at Jake. Sarah's bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Her second shot finished him, 3 of Morrison's men down. That left Morrison himself and 1 more gang member. "Sarah," Jake called out softly from across the camp. "I see Morrison near the main building. The last man is somewhere behind the old mine shaft." Sarah nodded, even though she knew Jake could not see her. She began working her way toward the mine shaft while Jake moved to face Morrison. The last gang member was cleverer than the others. He stayed hidden and waited for Sarah to come looking for him. When she rounded the corner of the old mine shaft building, he was ready for her. His first shot missed her head by inches. Sarah threw herself to the ground and rolled behind a wooden cart filled with old mining tools. Bullets crashed into the wood above her, sending splinters flying. Sarah waited for a pause in the shooting, then popped up and returned fire. She saw the man duck back behind the mine shaft entrance. "Give it up, lady," the man shouted. "You are outnumbered and outgunned." Sarah almost laughed at that. A week ago, she might have believed him. But Jake had taught her that numbers did not always matter in a gunfight. What mattered was thinking clearly and using every advantage you could find. Sarah looked around and spotted a pile of loose rocks near the mine entrance. She picked up several stones and threw them to the left side of the building. The gang member heard the noise and started shooting in that direction. While he was distracted, Sarah moved quickly to a new position behind him. When he realized his mistake and turned around, Sarah was already aiming at him. "Drop your gun," she ordered. Bars, man hesitated for a moment, then tried to swing his rifle toward her. Sarah's shot hit him in the chest and he fell backward into the mine shaft. That left only Black Pete Morrison. Sarah ran toward the main building where she had last seen Jake. As she got closer, she could hear voices, Jake and Morrison talking to each other. "You cost me a lot of money, Sullivan," Morrison was saying, "and a lot of good men." "Your men were killers and thieves," Jake replied. "The world is better off without them." Sarah crept closer until she could see both men. They were standing about 20 feet apart in the open area in front of the main building. Morrison was a large man with a black beard and cold eyes. He held a gun in each hand. Jake stood calmly, his hands at his sides near his guns. But Sarah could see that he was wounded. Blood was running down his left arm from a bullet wound. "You know," Morrison continued, "I could have killed you any time in the past 6 months. But I wanted you to suffer first. I wanted you to know that you failed to protect those people, just like you failed to protect the Peterson family in Dodge City." Sarah saw Jake's jaw tighten at the mention of the Peterson family. "The only one who failed here is you, Morrison," Jake said quietly. "Your gang is finished. Your days of killing innocent people are over." Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Maybe so, but I am taking you with me." Both men went for their guns at the same time. Morrison was fast, faster than any man Sarah had ever seen except Jake. His 2 guns cleared their holsters in a blur of motion, but Jake was just a little bit faster. Jake's first bullet hit Morrison in the chest. His second shot came so quickly after the first that they almost sounded like one shot. Morrison's guns fired too, but his aim was spoiled by Jake's bullets hitting him. One shot went wild. The other bullet caught Jake in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around. Morrison fell to his knees, then forward onto his face. Black Pete Morrison, the terror of 3 territories, was dead. Jake staggered but remained on his feet. Sarah ran to him as he holstered his smoking guns. "How bad are you hurt?" she asked, looking at his wounded shoulder. Jake flexed his arm carefully. "Not too bad. The bullet went through. I will live." Sarah felt relief wash over her. They had done it. They had stopped Morrison and saved the prisoners. "The hostages," Jake said suddenly. "We need to make sure they are safe." They found the woman and children still hiding behind the rocks where Sarah had told them to wait. The old man was with them, all of them frightened but unharmed. "Is it over?" the woman asked. Sarah nodded. "It is over. You're safe now." The sun was rising as they made their way down the treacherous path from Devil's Mesa. Sarah and Jake took turns helping the injured prisoners while keeping watch for any other gang members who might have escaped. But they saw no one else. Morrison's gang had been completely destroyed. It took them 2 days to get the rescued prisoners back to their homes and to return to Deadwood Creek. Word of their victory had already spread through the territory. When they rode into town, a crowd was waiting for them in the street. Judge Harrison was the first to greet them. "Sarah, Jake, thank God you are both alive. We heard about the fight at Devil's Mesa." Murphy came out of his saloon with a bottle of his best whiskey. "Drinks are on the house for the heroes who stopped Black Pete Morrison." The crowd cheered and pressed around them, everyone wanting to hear the story of how they had defeated the notorious outlaw gang. But Sarah found herself looking at Jake instead of paying attention to the crowd. His arm was in a sling, and he looked tired. More than that, he looked like a man who had finally finished a job that had been weighing on him for a long time. Later that evening, after the celebrations had died down, Sarah and Jake sat on the porch of Murphy's saloon watching the sunset. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked. "Morrison is dead. His gang is finished. What will you do?" Jake was quiet for a moment. "I have been thinking about that. For 3 years, all I cared about was hunting down the men who killed innocent people. But maybe it is time I stopped running from my past and started thinking about the future." Sarah felt her heart beat faster. "What kind of future?" Jake looked at her with those dark eyes that had seemed so mysterious when she first met him. "Well, I was thinking that maybe Deadwood Creek could use a sheriff. Someone to keep the peace and protect folks from outlaws." Sarah smiled. "That sounds like a good idea. But what would I do? I have spent so much time thinking of myself as the fastest gun in the territory that I am not sure what else I am good at." Jake laughed softly. "Sarah, in the past week you have shown more courage, intelligence, and skill than most people show in a lifetime. You could do anything you set your mind to." Sarah thought about this. A week ago, her biggest goal had been to stay undefeated in gunfights. Now she realized there were more important things in life than personal glory. "Jake," she said slowly, "what if we worked together? You could be the sheriff and I could be your deputy. We make a good team." Jake's face lit up with the first real smile Sarah had seen from him. "You know, that is the best idea I have heard in years." They shook hands on the deal, and Sarah felt something she had never experienced before. She felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. She had found a partner she could trust completely, and a purpose that was more important than her own reputation. "Jake," she said as they watched the stars come out, "remember when I told you that no man had beaten me yet?" Jake nodded. Sarah smiled. "I am glad you never tried, because now I have found something better than being unbeatable." "What is that?" Sarah looked at her new partner, her friend, and the man who had taught her what real courage meant. "I found someone who does not need to beat me, someone who makes me better than I ever thought I could be." Jake adjusted his hat one more time, but now it was a gesture of satisfaction rather than concealment. "Sarah McKenna," he said, "I think this is the beginning of a beautiful partnership." As they sat together on the porch planning their future, as law officers and partners, Sarah realized that her life had changed completely from what it had been just 1 week earlier. She was no longer just the fastest gun in 3 territories. She was someone who protected innocent people, who worked as part of a team, and who had learned that the most important victories were not won alone. The moon rose over Deadwood Creek, shining down on a town that was now a little bit safer because 2 people had learned to trust each other completely. And in Murphy's saloon behind them, the bartender was already telling the story of how Sarah McKenna and Jake Sullivan had brought justice to the territory and peace to the families that Black Pete Morrison had threatened. It was a story that would be told for many years to come. A story about courage, partnership, and the discovery that sometimes the best way to be strong is to find someone you can depend on. Sarah McKenna had finally met her match in Jake Sullivan. But instead of defeat, she had found victory in a form she never could have imagined.